this is the main UI for Power Raid. We'll start with the Raid Buffs tab, which will allow you to check for each raid buff that is not a Paladin buff in your raid. You can scan for the buffs, which will scan the buffs on each of your raid members, and you can report who has or who does not have the buffs. The report settings will change how the report works. There are 6 different kinds of reporting. Players having all, which will list all the players in this case that have every raid buff. Players having 1 or more, which will list all of the players that have at least 1 raid buff. Players missing 1 or more, which will list all the players that have 1 or more missing raid buffs. And players missing all, which will list all the players that are missing all of the raid buffs. And then the other 2 categories are raid buffs that each player has, which will list each individual raid buff and list each player that has that buff. And raid buffs that each player is missing will list each individual buff and list each player for each one where that player is missing that buff. They should be self-explanatory, and they'll be situational based on which tab you're working on, but each of these 6 categories will apply to all the other tabs. And then there's different report channels as well. These will seem familiar to you, and then export will export to a dialog window where you can copy paste the data to other locations if you want to store that. And there's an example below for each category or report type to indicate what it would look like if you were to report it. So you can see here as you change the type, it'll indicate a new example. And for here, we can do this example. So it indicates that for each of these buffs, these players are missing those buffs. And the bracketed number is the group number they are in the raid. So that's the Raid Buffs tab. The World Buffs tab is extremely similar, except in this case, they're world buffs, not buffs that players can cast on each other. So you might want to change how your default reporting settings are. By default, it's set to world buffs that each player, or players having 1 or more world buffs. So that'll indicate to your raid which players have gotten at least 1 world buff. So you can check who is, trying the hardest potentially. And it exports the same way. So you can see here how these are the players that have at least 1 world buff in this case. And you can check which ones you want to check for. The Dire Maul tribute buffs will check for 1 of all 3. And the Darkmoon Fair buffs will check for 1 of any of these as well. The Raid Items tab checks for these raid items in their bags. And this final one here checks for if the player has the Onyxia Scale Cloak equipped on their person. So you can scan for items here, and it will indicate which ones the players have in their bags. And the reporting works exactly the same way. So you can report, for example, raid items that each player is missing to export. And that'll allow you to see which players are missing which items. And you can see here, this indicates that for Oni Cloak, these players don't have Oni Cloak in their bags, for example. The Consumables tab is the most complicated. You can choose between checking for items in their item consumables or the buff on their person, on their character. So in this case, we'll start with item, and you can check for individual specs as well. You can also check for all. And then you can also have settings unique to each boss if you so like, but you can leave it on general if you don't care. And the lesser toggle here will allow you to enable lesser versions of each buff or item to count towards the count number that you're looking for. So for example, if you set Greater Fire Protection Potion to 5 and somebody only had 5 regular Fire Protection Potions in their bag, that would count towards that. So if we scan here, we can see that only these 2 players have at least 5 Greater Fire Protection Potions in their bag, or the lessers as well. And if you want to customize all these different consumables for each class, you can go in here and you can remove from the current one or add to the current one by just clicking any of these. And if you want to change a specific class, you can go into your specific class and you can remove or add to the specific class. Keep in mind that if you add to all classes, it will remove from all the other classes. So anything that's in here will not be in the other categories. And the same report settings apply here, and these will just apply to all of the different items that you have. So for example, if we go in here and check a couple of mage consumes and say scan, the mages will have extra that show up for them. The talents tab works a little bit differently. You can specify a spec, and you can specify spec data for each spec, and you can get this data from the Wowhead talent calculator. It's a series of numbers with dashes. So for example, for a druid, we can say, we can just create a test spec here and maybe just do something like that. So like the first couple. So if we add this here, we can see that this druid in the group does not satisfy this spec. And then we can also see this spec here. And if you select it, it will delete it. So you no longer have that spec here. The report settings are slightly different on the talents tab. It just has players with invalid talents and players with valid talents. And it will just list them. And you can do it to the same channels as well. The settings tab, just all it lets you do is turn off the smart buff filtering, which disables checking intellect on warriors, for example, which I'd recommend leaving on, and you can turn the minimap icon on and off. You can also check for all the versions of people in the raid to see who has the add-on and who doesn't, and who has old versions. The final setting is you can export your settings to a giant text string. So somebody else could import all the settings that you've customized for your various bosses or various classes in the Consumables tab, or all the world buffs and raid buffs you've checked. So you can export that here. You can copy this, and then to import, you would just import it here and import the settings string. And you'll be able to copy settings from any player if they send you that string. Those are all the different settings for Power Raid. Hope you enjoy using it, and hope it makes your raids better.